access to justice. And this workshop is part of that third component. Our subject today is going to be voting, democracy, and the law. If you have paid any attention at all to not just our national elections, but state and local elections in various parts of the country, then you know that there is a huge access to justice issue around voting rights and access to the polls. And so we're going to have that be our focus today. We're going to have some great first presentations from experts and then engage in a bit of dialogue with our students, faculty, and staff in the room. I want to thank two of our student organizations, PILSO and NLG, for their co-sponsorship of today's event. I expect many of you, if not all of you, to be part of addressing these and other access to justice issues in your career. So I'm particularly happy to partner with you now as members of student organizations. So that's it for me. Thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. And now I'm going to invite Professor Diamond to introduce our guests.
I'm going to talk from, I guess I'll talk from over here. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Okay, so thank you, Dean Anderson, for the welcome and for supporting and encouraging important programs like this one and being so committed to access to justice initiatives. I think most of you know me. A lot of my students are here from this semester. I'm Elise Diamond, and I lead the Public Interest Law Center, and I'm an adjunct professor. And add my welcome to the second annual Access to Justice workshop on voting, democracy, and the law. And I'm incredibly excited for today. We have this amazing panel, who I will introduce in just a moment, followed by a short video. And then, really want to save some time also for some active engagement discussion workshop component at your tables after that. So we have a really packed agenda, and we're going to jump in just a second, but just indulge me for two pieces of business before we do that, and thank yous, because once we get going, we're just going to go as long as we can and as long as everybody can stay as close to 2. So I just wanted to thank Kate Filzer, the PILC Access to Justice Program Manager, who's been integral in all aspects of planning the event. Elisabeth Carline, our PILC Project Coordinator, who likewise has provided tons of support, including shuttling this morning service from the White Plains train station. Many thanks to Renee Brown-Cheng, Assistant Director for Marketing Communications and Special Events, and all the facilities staff for the logistical setup. Rachel Silva, our Assistant Dean for External Affairs, for the great flyer, and Danny Matthew and his team for the IT support, and Nesta Wright, who helped us with our video. Also, again, thank you to NLG and PILSO for co-sponsoring. And thank you to my Access to Justice seminar students. This workshop is the culmination of that class. And so thank you for your enthusiasm, not just for this today, but for all of our different speakers and events during the semester. As Dean Anderson shared, the workshop grew out of and is a component of the law school's broader Access to Justice project and initiatives, and was intended to put to action the law school's stated commitment to ensuring our students, faculty, and staff would use the training, energy, and resources to affect change in the way the law is taught, learned, and applied to promote social and legal justice. So specifically, the workshop was to bring us together with experts, community leaders, and advocates for an interactive discussion on a specific topic. And this year, of course, it's voting rights and democracy. And the last thing I'll just note is that obviously our university is prohibited from participating or intervening in any political campaign on behalf or in opposition to any candidate for public office or engaging in partisan political events. So the university does not support or oppose candidates for political office, and any personal opinions expressed are not those of the university. So just give you that caveat. Now, our focus is voting, democracy, and the law. And in the truest sense of the words, it's an embarrassment of riches to have this panel with us come on our campus today. The registration links to their expansive bios. So we're not gonna, I encourage you all to go and read those thoroughly. I'm gonna highlight just a few things about each of them and we obviously they will try to touch on as much of the active work that they are doing as we can in the context of our panel. So Sophia Lynn Lakin is the interim co-director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project. In her role, she assists the planning, strategy, and supervision of the ACLU's voting rights litigation nationwide. She has an active docket protecting voting rights and combating voter suppression across the country, and has led or worked on numerous successful challenges to discriminatory voting laws all over the country. She's currently lead counsel, I'm just going to name a couple, on several state redistricting cases around the country. The ACLU's lead counsel in 6th District of African Methodist Episcopal Church versus Kemp, the federal lawsuit challenging multiple provisions of Georgia's sweeping new voter law, and has served as lead counsel in successful challenges to unlawful voter purge program in Indiana, a case defending against the attack of the use of drive-through voting in Harris County, Texas, and in a suit representing voters' attempt to block certification of the 2020 presidential election, just to name a few. So that is just the start, just the beginning, right, of what Sophia is doing these days. Next to her, we have Perry Grossman. He's the director of the Voting Rights Project for the ACLU of New York. And his work likewise focuses primarily on litigation and advocacy efforts concerning voting rights and election law. His cases, again, too many to enumerate, but include the NAACP versus East Ramapo Central School District, a successful racial vote dilution case brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Another case, a successful intervention to prevent the disenfranchisement of 127,000 voters in Harris County, Texas, who used drive-through voting in the 2020 election, same case, right? And other cases protecting equitable access to early voting for voters closer to home in Rockland and Rensselaer counties. He was also counsel of record for the ACO's briefs in partisan gerrymandering case, and also, while slightly off topic, in the SDLU's amicus brief in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, the Second Amendment challenge to New York's regulations on carrying concealed handguns. So thank you. Next, we have Brianna Sia. Brianna is the executive director and founder of Generation Vote, or Gen Vote, an advocacy movement that empowers youth to be agents of change in local electoral politics and to work toward a just democracy. She's a prominent youth voting rights organizer, as well as an advocate for the Asian American and Pacific Islanders community in New York City, frequent media commentator, and the youngest chapter president on the OCA National Board, where she works to advance the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Americans in New York City. She's also a former senior research and program associate at the Brennan Center for Justice, where her work focused on the census and redistricting. And so last, but and I just want to acknowledge too, Brendan Cushing, who's the managing director of Gen Vote, is here too. So thank you for being here as well. And last but not at all least, Jared Berg is the co-founder and voting rights counsel at Vote Early NY, a nonpartisan nonprofit created to educate and inform the public about their rights under New York's voting laws, and to ensure that election reforms are implemented in the spirit with which they were enacted and made accessible to all New York voters. With its partner, Vote Early NY provides all kinds of rights-based civic education and works on policy and advocacy to build a culture of voting and engagement that empowers communities and reduces dependence on partisan campaigns and administrators. Lots more to talk about with all of you. So without further ado, we'll just say a quick thank you for being here. We'll take a big deep breath, because that was a lot to take in, and we're going to dive in. So obviously that's a lot, and there's tremendous amount of work that you are all doing right now. But I think for everybody here, it would be really helpful to give some context before we dive into some of the ongoing litigation and advocacy efforts, a little bit of the historical context and perspective as it relates to voting rights and elections in our country. So in essence, to remind us about, or tell us about the sort of democratic and undemocratic structures that as 21st century Americans, we have inherited and so inform what is happening today. So I'm going to, and I apologize in advance since we want to get through a bunch, I'm going to say maybe 3 to 5 minutes or each of you in addressing that. I don't know, Sophia, if you would like to start.
Sure. I mean, obviously, that's a huge topic, and the efforts in this country to restrict access to power structures of this country is as old as this country itself and predates it for many, many hundreds of years. That impulse to restrict voting access, to restrict political participation to those already in power, and in this country, that's been landowners, property owners, white, male, and has slowly increased over time through violence, through massive struggle, through constant vigilance, to where we are today. And there's a ton of history that we could go through, but the things that we are seeing today, the concerns that you are seeing today, the efforts to restrict access to the ballot, who can vote, when they can vote, whether their vote is counted, how well their vote is counted, whether that vote is counted equally, all of those things that you're seeing today in the news that you're reading about have their roots that stretch as far, far back in time. There are simply reiterations, maybe novel, more subtle, more innovative, shall we say, efforts to do things that we have seen time and time again. You hear about voter ID restrictions, you hear about polling place access, you hear about disinformation, misinformation. You think about what we saw during the Jim Crow years and the aftermath of Reconstruction, and the roots are there. Literacy tests are a form of ballot access issues that we are seeing today, issues about language access, issues about how ballot design, even how easy is it to navigate the labyrinth of processes in order to just cast your ballot and have a voice. That can be traced back to literacy tests, a modern form of literacy tests, photo ID, restrictions on registrations, making that more complicated. Those, again, time and time again, these have roots that stretch far, far back in time. The other primary theme of all of this, of course, is not just that voter suppression is a real thing and that has this historic aspect to it, but that it is also bound up very, very integrally, intimately, and completely intertwined with issues of racism, structural inequality. The story of race in this country is the story of this country. And so when you're seeing these different aspects, the fact that the matter is when people talk about it in partisan terms and then try to make it about a partisan issue, it is that, but it is also, if anything, much more rooted in historic racism of this country and sort of the original sin of this country that stays with us today. So it's very important for the work that we do, the sort of public education we do, the advocacy work that we do to ensure that we are continuously highlighting that, because it has remained with us. And to the extent that's the narrative kind of moves away, we risk backsliding into a world where we fought, people died time and time again to ensure that they had the right to vote in the 1960s, 1965. We can talk about civil rights movement. We can talk about Shelby County and the march across the Selma Bridge. And the concern that I have when we start losing sight of that is we will backslide into a world where we have people who can participate and people who cannot participate, and they fall along racial lines in this country. So there's a lot that we can certainly talk about, but the fact of that this is a cyclical voter suppression and progress. They're two sides of the same coin. It's cyclical that we see, and that right now I think we're unfortunately in a period of time of retrenchment. I think is an important thing to keep in mind, and know that nothing that we're seeing here is new. These are all tactics that have worked in the past and require constant vigilance.
Okay.
Sophia really covers a lot there. First of all, it's just nice to be here. It's nice to be up here with my friends. This is a small community in the voting rights advocacy space. And so it's hard to show up to a panel and not be among friends, but I'm especially glad to see these folks today. Just to sort of take off on what Sophia said, right? In 1870, you have the passage of the 15th Amendment, and you've got 95 years from there until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in those interim 95 years, there are just so many efforts ranging from the truly obvious violence to, literacy tests and grandfather clauses, all these sort of vote denial schemes, right? And we talk about those vote denial schemes as first generation barriers, right? Things that keep people from casting a ballot, things that make it harder for people to register and vote. And with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we see a lot of those things eradicated, right? With the 24th Amendment eradicating poll taxes. But as Sophia mentioned, discrimination always gets more subtle and sophisticated because people in power do not want to give up power. Voting rights, democracy, election law, this is all about how do we construct the process for gaining power and for holding on to power. And of course, it is incumbent legislators and governors and whatnot who also happen to be in charge of the lawmaking process. And it is rational, if not problematic and deeply discriminatory, to have them in control of the powers that keep them in power. So anyway, we see more subtle and sophisticated methods of discrimination over time. We go from the sort of obvious and first generation vote denial to vote dilution, right? So you might be familiar with terms like gerrymandering, whether it's racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. We go from how do we keep people from getting to the ballot to, even if people show up at the ballot box, how do we make sure the people we don't like, their votes count less, right? And so we see that occur in a lot of different ways. And as technology gets more sophisticated, as data becomes more widely available, the ability of people in power to devise schemes that will effectively keep them in power improves. Concomitantly, our ability to suss out where people are abusing those structures to remain in power also improves, but it's this constant game of whack-a-mole where we're trying to figure out, well, what are they doing? How do we suss it out? How do we fight it? And, working with the tools we have. And then also in New York State, because we've got a more progressive environment legislatively, we're able to also construct the tools we need. So you'll hear me talk about the New York Voting Rights Act, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, more than a few times over the course of today, because it becomes incumbent upon us as a state, which for sure has lots of its own problems. I would be very much in another line of work if we didn't have so many problems here. But it becomes incumbent upon us to do better, to strive towards a democracy that other states can emulate, that the country as a whole can emulate. And so we're doing our best to look at the way discrimination in voting, voter suppression, racialized or otherwise, gender-based voting discrimination, age-based voting discrimination. How do we get ahead of that curve? How do we look at what's been done in the past and prevent that continued evolution so we work towards a more equitable democracy going forward, where we're seeing elections run and won based on who are the best candidates, who's running the best campaigns, who's out stumping for voters and trying to get those votes. That's what democracy should fundamentally be about. And so we're constantly thinking about how do we move the improper barriers to good political electoral competition.
Awesome. Thanks, Perry. And definitely resonated with what Perry said about this panel being amongst friends. Perry and Jared had kind of seen me grow up a little bit in this space. They knew me when I was a wee sophomore at SUNY Binghamton, to shout any Bearcats in the room. And to Perry's point, I'm the founder of a youth voting rights organization. And when people hear about the origin story of Generation Vote, they're very surprised to hear that we started in New York. They're like, a voting rights organization starting in New York and going national? What? That New York has bad voter laws. And I have to explain to people, I became politicized and became really freaking angry about this issue because I was disenfranchised as a young voter in the first presidential primary that I tried voting in because of the archaic registration deadlines that New York State had at the time. And I was hearing from my friends about, challenges of trying to access the ballot because we didn't have early voting, right, in New York at the time. And so I often have to explain to people, yeah, until recently, New York had some of the worst election laws in the country. And then the problems that I was experiencing as a young voter and that our friends were experiencing as young voters in New York are also problems that we're seeing from young voters across the country. So yeah, it starts in New York, and we're really excited. I'm excited to share more about my story as an advocate. I'm definitely not the legal expert on the panel, but I can definitely talk to the challenges that we've seen across the country with trying to turn out the youth vote, and in part, bringing it back to the history of voting rights. And Sophia raised like a lot of the issues we're seeing today targeting the vote of young and POC voters. We've seen these tactics for decades, right? But what I will say is that, at least from Generation Vote's perspective, we have seen the past 10 years a much more nuanced and targeted effort to specifically suppress the vote of young people that look just like us in this room. And it's because our generation, Gen Z and millennial voters, we are becoming increasingly the most diverse generation across the country. We're also increasingly becoming the most powerful voting bloc. This past midterm, young voters had the second highest turnout in a midterm election following our last midterms. And so people in power are afraid of us. And so they're trying to look at the tactics that have been used throughout history and figuring out how can we specifically ensure that we can suppress the vote of young people, because they are the future. Right. And so whether it be using tactics like residency requirements, right, or restricting student IDs as voter identifications in other states, we're seeing a movement, an anti-democracy movement that is recognizing the power of the youth vote and specifically trying to target that power and that vote. And so what we do at Generation Vote is we go around and we talk to young people to say, hey, if you care about women's rights, if you care about climate justice, if you care about gun violence, which is a very relevant topic every single day of 2023, you need to care about voting rights. You need to care about electoral justice. And for Generation Vote, our mission statement is to spark an intersectional youth-led movement that fights for our right to vote and a just democracy for all. And the just democracy for all is in there because we have been hearing from young people across the country and across New York that the reason why they don't care about voting rights, the reason why they don't care about democracy is because truly, we've never had a just democracy that worked for people that look like us, that worked for POC voters in this country. And so why should I care about institutions and a system that doesn't work for me and that's specifically trying to suppress my power? And so Generation Vote, we're trying to change the narrative, right? Yes, we recognize that we've never had a just democracy for all, but how can we get there, to Perry's point, right? How can we look to the future? And we need our generation to care, because historically, behind every suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, it was young people that led the charge. And so we need to make sure that in this future movements fighting for voting rights and democracy, young people continue to be in the charge. And so that's hopefully the perspective I bring to this panel today.
I agree. Benefit of going last with a bunch of awesome experts ahead of me. No, I do agree. I want to thank Professor Diamond and the Dean and the Access to Justice program and you folks who are in this program. Thank you so much for being here and for your interest in this area. You folks are helping to make PACE a leader among law schools at a time and in an area of the law where this work is critically important for young lawyers coming up, deciding how you're going to use your God-given talents and your time to improve the world that we inherited, right? And so taking the prompt, I think I want to chat briefly about America as the series of contradictions that I think we all recognize it is, right? And of course, the original sin as is present in its various iterations still today. And yet, I encourage folks to look at the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. I won't take you all the way back to the beginning, but if you look at the Declaration of Independence and just the revolutionary document that was, a lot of people focus on life, liberty, and property, these rights that we don't need to mention, that of course we have to write down and mention somewhere. But I prefer to focus on the rest of that clause, the consent of the governed, which is the basis for any legitimate government to this day. And then there's everything else, right? every other sort of system that's out there. We inherited a constitution that was written in a time of enlightenment, but not from today's perspective, right? Congress shall make no law, this concept of negative rights, as opposed to enshrining a positive set of rights that we could, that would explicitly say that all people, all citizens, all men and women shall have the right to vote, or whatever iteration we could come up with. The challenges of amending that document. So we are stuck with, right? We've inherited this document and the revolutionary character of it at that time, and yet we are now saddled with basically an inability to change that framework. And with talented colleagues like the folks sitting with me, working within that framework and the laws that are based on it to try to deliver modern justice in light of that framework. I think that there's language in there about your ability, your right to petition the government for grievances. I think that sort of language comes close to this implied right to vote that is the underpinning of our system. But to sort of take a phrase and for purposes that I think you folks would agree with, right? If the arc of the moral universe, it bends in fits and starts. It's long, but it bends in the direction inevitably of universal suffrage. And so we do see this pendulum, and unfortunately, we might be living in a period of retrenchment and regression right now, but we do see positive things happening. We see the backlash to progress before our eyes in so many states. So to wrap up, some of these structures that we've inherited that we are sort of stuck with are the Electoral College, the Senate's filibuster rule, the concept of gerrymandering, right? That lawmakers make the lines that their voters vote on, and that was the default system. And it's only now that we're moving to a system of voters, not politicians, drawing the lines and that sort of thing. I mentioned the concept that the Constitution is an ancient document, and we are trying to interpret it in modern ways. But there's the Supreme Court and that structure, the fact that we have federal judges appointed for life and not responsive to the broader public. And I think it's worth mentioning disenfranchisement as a policy. You look at the history of voter registration, start asking questions. When did we get this requirement that we register at all? Where does that come from? And when did it start to get built out? There was a time in this state when you had to register before every single election. But what's fascinating is you look at disenfranchisement policy, this idea that we blanket disenfranchise voters upon their conviction of a serious offense, an infamous offense. And that language started to get added to state constitutions as we saw the passage and implementation of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. So we do see these pendulums swing and the backlash to that. My colleagues are fighting the good fight using the VRA and soon to be with us a state VRA as well. So I'll wrap there. Thanks again for being here.
I think maybe make it a little more local for a second. So, you see in the papers the case of Sophia Gates. Sophia, by the way, is extremely famous.
Yes.
She should be here by herself. It's delightful for us that we get to be here. But I want to mention the cases that we don't see in the newspaper, which are extremely important, which nobody pays attention to. The most expensive and important function of local government is public education, right? School districts in New York State, we have about 675 to 700 run their own elections. Here in White Plains, 78% of the student body in the public schools here are children of color. There are 7 members of the Board of Education. Only one of them is a person of color. I believe Latino students make about half the population of the White Plains public schools, and Latinos make up, I believe, about 30% of the population of the city as a whole, but have no representation, descriptive representation, at least on the Board of Education, and turnout in Board of Education races when it's contested at all is under about 10%. So right here in White Plains, you've got a serious local government with a budget that is easily 9 figures, engaged in the most important function of local government that there is, that nobody votes in and does not appear to be accountable to voters of color in any meaningful way. I could probably do something similar in almost any jurisdiction in the state find a place, because our local government elections, our villages, our towns, our counties, our school districts, our special purpose districts, which are a completely separate and ridiculous set of things. These are all governments with important functions. They serve the primary purposes that you engage with government every day: public safety, public education, transportation, parks, you name it. And nobody is paying attention. Nobody is accountable. We have massive voter suppression, especially here in New York. And this is all something that everybody in this room could be doing something about. And it's not just about litigating, right? And we'll get to this for sure. Sophia is famous because she should be famous, because she is wonderful, but it's also because litigators get an outsized amount of the credit, right? Brianna actually wrote a whole article about how Brianna should get more credit for what she does and how Jared should get more credit for what she does. But it is integrated advocacy in all of our home communities that's going to make a difference. It is litigation married with organizing, married with policy advocacy, starting at the local level and going all the way up, that is going to make a difference. So as we are talking today, I don't want to think that this is a spectator sport, that we are looking at what people in other jurisdictions do and how bad it is. We got stuff right here in our own backyard that is a very real problem that we can all be doing something about.
Best 20-minute voting democracy civics lesson of all time. Okay, so that's a great transition of into some of the actual, from Sophia and Perry made litigation to Bree to advocacy and Jared to also advocacy and policy to kind of talk about some of these current. I have some ideas, but I feel like I should let you choose what you think is you're most interested in sharing. Obviously, we have Sophia, the federal lawsuit challenging provisions of Georgia's new law. That seems like a good place, a good thing to talk about. Perry, we have the racial dilution case that you did already, and other ongoing. So I'm going to let you guys choose what you think would be most interesting to share that you're working on.
Do you want to start?
It's been a long time since you had a turn.
Yeah, no. And I want to echo the thanks that everyone has said on this panel that I neglected to say to all of you for being here and how important it was events like these when I was in law school that ultimately led me on my journey into voting rights work, which was not something I thought about actually until my very, very, very last summer in law school. And so thank you for being here and hearing more about the work that we do across the board. And I think the point, and I wanted to sort of pick up on the point that Perry has highlighted about the fact that, yes, you hear a lot about litigation, you hear a lot about the court battles because there's an element of a quick resolution or a sort of definitive ruling on that. But especially in this moment, I would say, where what we're seeing is the federal courts slowly taking away the tools that Perry has talked about, the tools that we have at the federal level in order to fight back against these kinds of attempts to either dilute someone's vote, to make it count less than it should, count less equally, who we count at all, who can vote at all, who has access to the ballot and how they have access to the ballot. These tools are being slowly eroded in time by the federal courts, and federal Congress is at a standstill on this. There's not a will or a movement to really push something forward. We had a huge effort 2 years ago to try to restore the strength of the Voting Rights Act, which has been slowly, the heart of it sort of gutted. These fabulous tools that we had to ensure that everyone had the access to the ballot. These tools have been sort of taken away over time, and we weren't able to get that the Federal Voting Rights Act passed during that time. And so that really, really leaves both what's happening at the local and state levels, what you can do either to pass like a state level Voting Rights Act and really use it locally, but also really taking control of your daily life by being involved, going to these local community meetings, these school board meetings, really understanding what's happening. If you care about your community, you care about policing, housing, employment, education, yes, you hear a lot about what's happening at the federal level, but really more and more so as the court's been sort of pushing things, stripping, the federal government of their ability to ensure equal access, equal opportunity across the subject matters you might be interested in, and pushing it down to the states. What you do is going to be more and more localized, at least for the foreseeable future. So your voices in those local elections, your voices in those local governance meetings, petitioning your local police boards, these kinds of things, you care about those issues, you got to start local. So I wanted to echo that 100% and really lift that up, because I think it's extraordinarily important. It often gets lost for a number of voter suppressive reasons, including, for example, having local elections held in the springtime, which we see when no one knows that they're happening. So that there's a history to that as well. But in terms of, the litigation that I am working on, I would say the heart of what we're doing right in this moment in time is redistricting litigation. And I just want to lift that up because that's, I think it's hard to, it's not as easy to understand. It's a little less sexy right now, but it is so important. If, for example, you're able to go to the ballot box, you are able to cast your ballot, but at the end of the day, the lines are drawn so that it does not matter. That what worse way can you do to tell somebody, to Brianna's point, that that just doesn't matter what you do if you show up or not. So the bulk of our work since the 2020 census, which hopefully everyone participated in, and you should definitely be counted, it has been this work to ensure that there are maps that fairly reflect the population, all these demographic shifts that we have been seeing across this country, that it is reflected in the way that lines are drawn. We thought we would be a little farther along in this process, but are once again have been sort of stymied by the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court in getting this done. So our work in sort of the state level, challenging to like congressional maps, state House, state Senate, these maps across the board, it's still ongoing and is the bulk of our work. We have 11 active litigation cases challenging state level maps. And we thought by this point in time, we would be closer to moving to the next stage, which would be more challenges to local elections, the way that local elections are structured, and the redistricting of local elections maps, but we just haven't been able to get there. So you can sort of see sort of the difficulty in getting large scale changes through litigation and why it's so important to really be working at these other levers of government. So that's the bulk of our work, but in connection to that, we are also still faced with all these very sweeping, I would say, voter suppression bills that are much more subtle in nature, right? So you think about Georgia 2020 election, we're talking about, less than 12,000 votes, if you recall, Trump asking for a certain number of votes to be found in Georgia. So we're talking about narrow margins in some of these places. So the type of voter suppression you need in order to really have an impact on the outcomes, especially of state level races, is small. So you can be very targeted with the data that Perry has talked about how you go about making it more difficult for certain voters in certain places by using very subtle measures. And that's what we are contending with in an environment where we have fewer tools, and the tools are being the burden that is put on people challenging laws has increased dramatically, and where the Supreme Court has sort of blessed a state saying, hey, if people feel like we should have more, make it more difficult to vote because they think it might be more secure, then that's fine. That's enough of a justification to impose a burden. No questions asked about whose voter confidence you're talking about, no justification, but any of that. That makes our lives much more difficult. So in our case challenging various provisions of the sweeping voter suppression law in Georgia, we have both brought sort of traditional challenges under the 14th and 15th Amendments, under the Voting Rights Act, but also have tried to think about other ways to get at, to sort of open the eyes of the courts, but also because our tools are being more restricted. So for example, we're using really trying to use the First Amendment a little bit more directly. So First Amendment, I would say, is always bound up in the right to vote. This is your core political speech, is casting a ballot in an election, having a say in who represents you and makes your laws. So, but for example, we're seeing much more attempts to criminalize the ballot box, criminalize aspects around the ballot box, criminalize people who are trying to help people access the ballot. These are things that we've seen before, as I said, but we're seeing an increased attempt to do that right now. So using the First Amendment to say, when you restrict in Georgia, the ability of people to provide relief to people waiting in hours-long lines in counties that are primarily Black and brown communities, precincts like that, when you restrict their ability to give someone a sip of water, to give them a snack, to give them a chair, to sit in the hot sun or in the rain, pass them an umbrella to borrow, then you are restricting the First Amendment rights of those individuals who are trying to lift up the importance of the humanity of the people waiting in line, but also the importance of having a voice and staying in line and voting. We're also looking at tools like the Americans with Disabilities Act, because once again, like many of these restrictions having a disproportionate cost and burden on young voters, on voters of color, they do also on voters with disabilities. And this is a community in general, I would say, that often gets overlooked when we're talking about access in general, equal opportunity in general in this country. And so using that as a way, again, to sort of educate the court about what is going on here, and to provide another avenue and another, I would say, opportunity to lift up voices that are otherwise marginalized in our process, in order to find new ways to push back against some of these more subtle, more difficult challenges. And we're doing that sort of across the country as one of our sort of newer strategies of trying to push back on some of these provisions. So I could talk more about that. People are curious about some of our litigation, but I'll leave it there.
I truly have no idea. Like, when do you find the time? So while Sophia is busy suing the entire country, which is impressive. And by the way, not an accident those voters in Georgia are waiting on long lines, right? The long lines are by design. And anytime you're seeing very long lines, that is rarely an accident. It is the fact that the community that is serviced by those polling places does not have enough clout, is not able to hold election officials accountable to make sure they have an adequate number of polling places. Lines in polling places always move fairly swiftly, and they're fairly short in affluent neighborhoods. You may notice that. So in terms of what I do, the most significant work is the work I do in partnership with all of them, right? Because I don't do anything on my own ever, because I am one person and I'm not, I can't work on as little sleep as Sophia. I do not have a voice as eloquent as Brianna's, and I am not as forceful an advocate as Jared. So I like to enlist a full team when going after any issue. So let me talk about sort of integrated advocacy in context here in New York, and what I mean when I say that. So one of the first cases I brought when I was brought in to be the voting rights guy at the NYCLU was NAACP v. East Ramapo, right? And if you don't know East Ramapo, it is a school district in Rockland County. It's pretty big. It's about 150,000 residents, spans 3 towns, covers a good portion of the place. And the public schools are 96% populated by students of color. There are, it's a very large private school community. Those private schools are about 99% white. You've got strict racially polarized voting. and a school district budget that had been voted down year after year after year. And even when turnout was at its absolute highest, after the Board of Education had decided to close 2 public school buildings and sell them at below market rates to private schools. Meanwhile, the public school community population keeps growing. Those students are in overcrowded classrooms. The budgets are such that they can't fill their schedules. They can't graduate on time, right? Real problems. And so we are investigating and prosecuting that vote dilution case. Along the way, we noticed that this is a relatively engaged community for a school district election, and its turnout in the absolute most contentious year hit about 20%. The stats I just pulled out on the White Plains School District were things I was just able to Google quickly. Unfortunately, while Graham was talking, but I was listening, I swear to God. And so I just texted my data guy and I said, what's turnout like in White Plains? And he says, well, it's the lowest out of the 42 school districts we've been looking into. It's about 3.5% per year. So the thing we noticed was that school district elections were not on anyone's radar at all. The elections were taking place on the 3rd Tuesday in May. There was no early voting, right? There was no language assistance. We noticed that there were 120 school districts on Long Island, which are all covered by federal law and required to offer Spanish language assistance. We're not doing. Had no idea, right? Because they run their own elections and the school district clerks. And again, none of this is necessarily because these are terrible human beings who are trying to suppress the voting rights of people of color. They're school district clerks. They are mostly used to running a school district, not professional elections officials. So we had to call up the Eastern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and say, send out letters to everybody and make sure they know they have to comply with this stuff. They are doing so now as of 2019, but these obligations have been in place for decades. So the point is, we noticed that there were all these structural issues, and that what we were seeing in East Ramapo was undoubtedly extreme, but it was an extreme example of a common problem. So how do we address it, right? I can't litigate 600 school districts, right? That's a problem. I can litigate one at a time. These are expensive cases, they're exhausting cases. So we think about policy change. So I talked to my friend Jared. I said, well, let's think about how we put together laws that are going to improve voter turnout generally, so we don't have to litigate 600 cases. Right. And in 2019, New York becomes what, the 38th state to offer early voting, right? We now have things like electronic voter registration. Hopefully, I think it's coming up this year at some point.
Yeah.
Automatic voter registration. We're able to make.
They're late.
Yeah, they're late. We're able to make policy changes so that when we see things coming up in litigation, we're able to take those lessons and apply them more broadly, because litigation is good at stopping the bad thing from happening, right? When Sophia and I had the opportunity to work together on Harris County drive-through voting, which is a fun one for both of us, right? We're able to stop the bad thing from happening, but we're not able to get more voters to go use drive-through voting as a result, right? When we litigated the case over the citizenship question in the census, we can get the courts to stop a citizenship question from being on the census. And by the way, the census, as Sophia noted before, is the fundamental building block of all this stuff. We can't litigate voting rights cases if we don't have good census data that adequately reflects our communities, total population, populations of color, sex, race, you name it. And, we can stop that through litigation, but we can't get people to fill out the census unless we go out and do that organizing work, unless we go out and do the policy work to get the government to adequately fund census outreach, right? If New York State had spent more money to go out and get everybody counted, we might not have lost a congressional seat in the last redistricting process, right? And so in the redistricting litigation that just happened, the map got significantly changed here in New York. That ended up having some pretty severe consequences, contributed in no small way to the composition of the U.S. House of Representatives and the fact that it's currently held by Republicans. Again, in my professional life, I have no judgment about that, but this stuff has consequences, right? And so, what my admonition is and what my goal as an impact litigator, but I'm not just an impact litigator, I'm a policy advocate, I'm there to be a public educator, right? I teach in addition to all this, I write. And I'm in small part, not on Brianna's level, an organizer. And that's what we should all be thinking about all the time. How do we use all the tools in the toolkit to achieve the kind of positive change that we're looking for? How do we work with the best allies out there to magnify our ability, to magnify our skills, and make sure that we're getting the best bang for not just our buck, but for all of the amazing efforts that we put in to making ourselves a better world. So, you know, I could spend way too much time getting into all my cases in detail. You do not want to hear about them. My wife is absolutely sick about them. My son is barely old enough to understand the things I say to him, and he's tired of hearing this stuff. But litigation is important. It is a partial solution at best ever. It is never, ever a complete solution. And so I always want you to be thinking in terms of integrated advocacy, because I certainly do.
Great. Yeah, Brianna, if you would pick up on that, because that's exactly where your efforts come in.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Perry's hyping me up so much, and Perry in your own right is an amazing leader in this space and one of my mentors. Anyway, I guess I want to pick up on what Sophia and Perry were saying about understanding the tools, and especially as young people, the power that we have. A little bit of a side tangent. I love that we're talking about this. That's my project. Sorry. I love that we're talking about the census. I was mentioning in my bio that I was a senior researcher at the Brennan Center, and I worked I actually worked on that case and wrote a law review article at the age of 21, debunking the Trump administration's argument about the history of the citizenship question with Thomas Wolfe at Brennan, and I share that story because, again, I was a 21-year-old without a JD, and I somehow was able to, write a law review article that made it to the Supreme Court because I believed in my power as a young person, right? I used the tools that I learned from being an advocate and a researcher in the democracy space and brought it to my census work at Brennan Center. So I definitely think one of the things that Generation Vote that we aim to view in our organizers is understanding how can we utilize the power of young people and kind of see what tools are available at our discretion for fighting back against all these forces that are trying to suppress our voices, right? So the two things that I want to highlight in terms of like other tools to think about, at Generation Vote, we are a movement organization. When I started Generation Vote, when Perry and Jarrett knew me when I was a sophomore, it was not a movement org. We had a very different theory of change back then. But we basically relaunched the organization because we understood that if our generation wants to tackle this democratic crisis of our lifetime, we need to learn from other youth-led movements, especially from the last 10 years, March for Our Lives, Black Lives Matter, right? And all of those movements that were changing the public narrative were led by young people and by movement organizations that were in coalition with litigators, that were in coalition with policymakers. But it's really important that as young people, we understand the ecosystem and like what interventions are necessary to be able to have that transformative change. And as a movement organization, the tools that we focus on really come down to two things. It comes down to what can we do to organize people power? What campaigns can increase people power that then leads to transformative change around public opinion? And secondly, how do we build political power? And I'm saying this in a nonpartisan way, right? But if you look at the most successful movements of our time, they were able to combine those two things. And Generation Z and millennial voters, we are at the perfect position to be able to not only mobilize our peers, but also mobilize our peers to then have candidates and elected officials understand that if you do not fight for our issues, we can vote you out. And so in terms of some things that we've done in coalition with voting advocates the past few years to build people power, that looks like doing a hunger strike for democracy. So when we were introducing basically the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, my team was out in the Capitol down in DC fighting for the federal version. And one of the ways that we did that was actually putting our bodies on the line and showing that young people were willing to sacrifice and not eat for like 2 weeks. I did it for 1 week, but still, it was not easy, right?
I did it in solidarity for 90 minutes.
Yeah, but like
it was a hard 90 minutes.
Right. Yeah, imagine marching. When I was marching with the King family down there, I didn't eat after 5 days. But those type of actions show that our generation is taking these crises seriously, and it raises the moral urgency around the issues that we're fighting for, like voting rights and democracy. Other things that we've done in terms of building political power, one of the interventions that we are trying to bring in the space through Generation Vote is having young people understand who are the decision makers in your communities that actually have authority on policies and procedures that can make it easier for young people to vote or harder for young people to vote, right? Like, for example, having access to multilingual voter registration forms, or where ballot drop boxes are placed, and stuff like that.
Is there a polling place on campus here?
I don't think at Pace University law. Is there? No, yeah, not on the White Plains campus, no.
Oh.
Yeah.
Huh.
We probably should consider
They
that.
have a suggestion discussion guide on
Yeah,
the
we should look
table,
into that.
so, you know, that's,
Exactly.
that's,
Just saying.
that's where it's all about. That's
Yeah,
what it's all
actually,
about.
that's a good point to the next thing. So in terms of understanding decision makers, one type of decision maker that young people, I would argue I didn't think about this when I was a college student either, were election administrators, right? Understanding the role that in New York, for example, the Board of Elections and commissioners have in making it easier or harder for young people to vote. In other states, it looks like the Secretary of State. And so at Generation Vote, we were hearing from across the country and in New York State that young people had no freaking clue, you know, who their local Board of Election commissioners were. They had no idea in other states who the Secretary of State was. And so we realized, in terms of building political power in certain communities, that might be a decision maker that young people can influence in future elections. And so this past year, Generation Vote, we launched and led the first national youth GRTV effort to leverage the power of the youth vote to win Secretary of State elections in Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada. And what was so fascinating was our team spent months on the campaign trail in those states talking to young folks. And we realized that once we broke it down, the authority that these decision makers had over certain voting policies and how it affected young people really cared. And the majority of the time, they never heard from those campaigns before. And studies show that like less than 40% of young people in this past election even heard from any candidate. So imagine a Secretary of State campaign reaching out to young people. Like, they don't have the money for that in most states. And so once young people heard about the authority, and their ability to swing these potential races, they were all in. And it was so beautiful to see these young, and it was led by a young cohort of BIPOC organizers, which was really important for our team to have the movement be led by the people most impacted, talking to their peers about, this is how we can influence the Secretary of State. This is what their office does. If the election goes a certain way, we can hold them accountable and potentially push for things like student advisory task forces through Secretary of State office, right? Or even pushing for things like a Student Voter Empowerment Act, which I'll bring it back to New York. And so our team, that's the kind of what we're working on at the moment. And I'm happy to say all of the candidates we endorsed won. So we're in that accountability stage right now. And it's been really exciting to work with young people at these levels of government that like historically have been overlooked by young organizers. And I think generally by the democracy space until the 2021 insurrection, quite frankly. And so bring it back to New York, we don't have a Secretary of State in New York. The people that we have to have our eyes on is the Board of Elections and local and state board. And so when we were working in coalition with the Let New York Vote coalition, which is one of the largest coalitions on voting rights in the state, we saw that there was an opportunity to think about how can we leverage the authority and the power of the Board of Elections in our communities to increase youth voter turnout. And so it looked like a series of things in Generation Vote's work here in New York, such as releasing a report with the Brennan Center for Justice and Let New York Vote that outlined, here are ways that we can improve election administration in New York and how local boards can invest in hiring young poll workers and in procedures that can make it easier for high schoolers to engage in this process and college students. It also looked like us fighting for a law the past few years that would require local board of elections to work with universities to place polling locations on college campuses. And we're super stoked to say that policy passed. It became law last year. And so we're right now in the implementation phase. The whole BOE is accountable to place these poll sites on local college campuses that have 300 registered voters. And so
we're litigating it in November.
Exactly. Yep. So, it's these things about, what are really understanding how do we leverage people power and political power to identify the potential interventions necessary in the space, and then seeing what tools we have at our disposal, whether it be direct advocacy, litigation, policy. You need all of those approaches in order to get the public to care, and especially for young people to mobilize and be educated on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Jared, I'll let you talk about the policy work that your organization, right? This is in our seminar, right? What we talk about is sort of using all of these. It's not one method, right? It's the traditional, what we think of as the traditional advocacy litigation, but it's working with community organizers. It's working on the policy. It's working on the legislative end. On whatever the issue, certainly voting access impacts everything. But on whatever the access gap that you're trying to fill, it's going to take that combination.
So I want to start just by fleshing out a point that I think Sophia raised in passing. So the voting wars are playing out nationally and in different ways in different places. And I will chat about Albany in a moment. It's a little different what we're saddled with in New York and where we've been and where we're going. But there is this false choice between liberty and security. Comes up all the time in national security context, comes up all the time in balancing the law. I call it a false choice because it is not an either or. And in the voting context, when we hear about liberty security, we talk about access versus integrity. So what I encourage all you folks to do as young lawyers and critical thinkers, right, is when we hear that there's this amorphous, whether it's voter sentiment or the public trust or some very real harm that we're trying to prevent. What we never really look at, if we all accept voting as a fundamental right, and the Supreme Court has, is where is that narrow tailoring? And that's the piece of this that is often left out of the equation, right? Is how does the proposed restriction solve a problem? Bring data. Where is the problem that this is looking to solve? How does this actually make the system more secure? At whose expense and toward what end? And without that, it's really pretext. But it's so easy to get caught up in that sort of false choice and to sort of accept that any specious concern and solution that sounds like it could shore up someone's amorphous confidence somewhere, it's too easily embraced. In New York, we have different challenges. We have a legacy of a restrictive, outdated voting law and a balance in power that until 2019 did not have the political will to improve the voting laws. It was viewed as existential in Albany to a delicate balance of power legislatively between Republicans and Democrats that had been in place for decades. And so there was this idea that somehow liberalizing the voting laws in any sense, what do we mean by that? Making it easier for people to register, vote conveniently without difficulty and intimidation. Any sort of change there would do what? Make it possible for more people who were eligible to vote, but were not invited to the Democracy Party, not catching those early registration deadlines, not participating in elections, to participate, and that could change the balance of power. So what we're looking at now, right? And then I'm struck by this conversation over look at how we're fighting this fight. Long lines, right? Versus folding chairs, refreshments, and comfort stations. And so in other places, the fight is over what happens if you give someone a bottle of water? What happens why are we talking about that instead of the problem, which is that there are 4, 5, and 6 hour lines to vote in so many places, and that instead of criminalizing that contemptible fact, which is undermining access to our fundamental rights, we're fighting over the price of a bottle of water and the price of a slice of pizza and who can provide folding chairs and what hats they can wear and what can be written on them when people are just trying to make sure that citizens have access to the franchise. But in New York, there are 57 counties. We now have early voting for 9 days, 72 hours at least. There are 57 places, counties, localities outside New York City. That's every single local jurisdiction that allows people to vote at any of the early voting sites for those 9 days deployed in their county. The only place where you can't do that is New York City. So what does that mean? And remember, we have congressional districts that cross county lines. Some congressional districts have 5, 6, 7 counties within them. But if you live in New York 3, for example, if you're on the Nassau side of that line, you have 27 places you can early vote over 9 days for over 80 hours. If you live on the Queens side of that line, you got 1. And if there's a long line there, That's your site. Maybe come back tomorrow if that's an option for you, maybe not. But what does that do to your right to vote as a Nassau resident? In Westchester, if you're a Westchester resident, you have 23 sites. And the district that shares the county lines with the Bronx, you're a Bronx resident, you got one. And so that is a major component of access that we have not addressed here in New York. They have failed in New York City to deliver on that promise that early voting means vote near home, vote near work, vote where it's convenient for you, where you might take care of grandma or have childcare obligations. But it's almost like a whole different dimension that New York City voters don't have access to. And I don't see how that's not an equal protection issue when you have multiple systems within the same congressional district. There's so many things like that. It is budget season. There's $227 billion in the budget that's due 2 days from now. Probably not a penny for civic education, not a penny for civic education to tell people whether there's 2 options to vote, 2 ways to vote this year or 3. What your rights are, when are the deadlines, and who's entitled to vote, and when are the primaries, and all the rest. The boards are given not a penny by the state to inform the public. And so it's up to them whether they think it's a good idea to tell you folks what your rights are, what the deadlines are. Why is it that it took 20 years for us to claw out the data to tell people that we have this rule in New York called wrong church suppression that is impacting minority communities in a very different way than it's impacting non-majority minority communities? What does that even mean? If I'm confusing you, you've never heard of wrong church suppression, Google it. But there was this law in New York up until this year that said that if you appeared at any poll site that was not the one you were assigned to, and remember in New York City, you only have 1 for early voting, then your entire ballot was disqualified regardless of the fact that you were entitled to vote for all the statewide office holders. If you're in the right county, your county executive, you're in the city of New York, 5 boroughs, you're entitled to vote for mayor, congressional district, as long as you're in the right congressional district. We had this law on the books for years, and the only people who had access to this data, the big picture, was the State Board of Elections. And so we're hoping that that sort of thing will provide the kind of access to data in order to marshal evidence for better voting policy. Why is it that there's same-day registration in places like Utah, Virginia, and North Carolina, that they have a system of one-stop registration and voting, and only this year will New York finally implement 10-day registration? Who does that keep out? Who does that empower? Why can my grandmother vote by absentee ballot in Florida for any old reason, but here you need an excuse, and it's not even clear the scope of those excuses? So I think that's probably a good place to wrap. We have tons of stuff that we're trying to fight for in Albany. We're thrilled to work with any of you as well.
Awesome. I think we're going to stop there for a moment. I think we obviously have a video. We're going to have our wonderful panel also come and join some table discussions. But I think before we do that, maybe just allowing a question or 2 among the big group, and then so that everybody can hear some. Does anybody have? And I don't know if anybody's monitoring the chat, if there's any question on there, but yeah.
I have a question. First of all, thank you all so much for your time today. Really inspiring to hear. Do you think there's any merit to making election day a federal holiday, or would that help to stifle the availability of early voting? Because I was reading some arguments for and against. Some people were saying that if you make election day a federal holiday, they'll try and get rid of the early vote. But I certainly think it doesn't make sense that we don't have, everybody doesn't have holiday that day.
So I will weigh in by saying that I actually don't have, I'm ambivalent about the policy proposal, because when you've got a holiday, it's not like everybody gets the day off, right? The people who don't get the day off are actually probably the people who need voting flexibility more than anybody else. So my general preference in terms of policy prioritization is towards making sure there's more early voting, making sure there's more access to absentee voting, that we're making the ballot available that way, because the difficulty is if there is a rollback of early voting and still making election day a holiday, the people that you are ultimately trying to benefit would be the ones who are most hurt by that. So I'm not like per se opposed. I do like democracy a lot, and therefore don't mind a democracy oriented holiday, especially if I get the day off, which I probably won't.
Yeah, right.
But if you're going to do that, you've got to recognize that it's not going to benefit almost certainly the people you actually most want to benefit. And so you've got to come up with some sort of policy counterweight to say, if we're going to make Election Day a holiday, we cannot have early voting rollbacks. And in fact, we should do more to make sure that typically speaking, it's going to be low-wage service workers have even more access if we're giving more access to the people who can't take that day off.
Yeah, I'll just jump in terms of like young people. So we are seeing efforts, they're not so much organized by one organization. It's kind of like these decentralized movements, what you call a movement, of like student-led efforts to get at least time off to vote policies on college campuses at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think from Generation Vote's perspective, like we've worked with students to get, like, for example, Election Day off at NYU. So starting in 2024, NYU will cancel classes, or at least students will be excused, not cancel classes, but they will allow students to go vote. I don't think, though, that's the only solution. I think too often I see in these conversations that are led by student organizations or within the student space, like, yeah, let's cancel classes and like, let's get everyone off to vote. But if less than 40% of young people are hearing from candidates, if in a recent study that came out yesterday, 33% of young people in some states said that they wish they even had more info about the candidates, therefore they didn't even go vote based on that. Like if people aren't informed and are not being engaged, they may just go, I don't know, hang out with their friends that day, right? And so I do think if you are a student that's fighting for a time off to vote policy at your institution, which is great, you need to ensure that there is investment in civic education and that creation of a civic culture, so that your efforts to like pass time off to vote policies at your school is actually engaging young voters. Like I too often I see these one-off campaigns where there isn't like an infrastructure supporting the cancellation of classes, and then we kind of see people struggling once those policies pass to then get students to actually then go not only go vote, but maybe go work the poll site that's on campus. So I do think that there's merit to it, but I think too often when I hear canceling Election Day in the student space, it's not coupled with like really addressing the systemic reasons why young people are not turning out to vote. And I think really we should be prioritizing that first before we start canceling, or at least massively pushing cancellation of classes.
Right.
So very quickly, I think it's an important idea, but it was an important idea 30 years ago. I think it's an idea whose time has come and sort of gone. And that's not to say I oppose. It's to say that I believe in a reasonable election period so that people can access their rights. And just like maybe motor voter made sense 20 years ago, but now we're talking about AVR, we're talking about modern policy. I would like to see this energy turned into calling for a reasonable election period in every single state with minimum hours and days. And sure, if it's all capped off with the last day to vote is Election Day, it's a major civic event because we want to encourage every last eligible person to participate. I think that's wonderful icing on the cake, but there's so much more.
So I'm so sorry to cut off. Obviously, we would love to have these folks just continue on. And like I said, they'll join, but we do want to give everybody a chance to have those conversations at your table and do some reflecting and making suggestions on the guide, and have a chance for our panel to have some lunch and join you. And we also have a quick video that we want to show you. So I will just quickly introduce that. So we're very grateful to have gotten a video message from David Haub to share with you today for our community. You may know he is the co-founder of March for Our Lives and was sort of thrust into the world of activism by the largest school shooting in American history. So he's a Parkland survivor and became one of the most sort of compelling voices calling for everyone to get over politics and get something done, challenging Americans to stand up, speak out, and work to elect morally just leaders, regardless of party affiliation.
Hi, I'm David Hawk. I'm a co-founder of March for Our Lives. The day that I got involved in activism was February 14th of 2018. I got involved that day because on that day, while I was in my AP Environmental Science classroom, a school shooting started at my high school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. I turned to a classmate after we heard a pop outside of our door, and I said, hey, that kind of sounded like a gunshot. And in agreement, we both asked the teacher to close her door. After she closed her door, the fire alarm started going off. and thinking it was just a normal fire drill, we started walking outside to our fire evacuation zone. But soon after we got outside, we realized that this was anything but a drill, as a flood of students started running against us, saying, "Don't come this way, he's coming this way." Instinctually, myself and other classmates started following those other students, and I ended up being in a classroom that, unbeknownst to me, was right next to where the shooting was happening at the time. I was put in a culinary classroom along with about a couple dozen, maybe up to 60 other students in a matter of a couple seconds. In that classroom, I started interviewing my classmates. I started texting my sister as well. My sister, Lauren, was a 14-year-old freshman at the time. And after I had texted her, I was worried that those would be the last words that I ever said to her. So I took out my phone and I started interviewing my classmates, not as an activist, but as a student journalist. As somebody who knew about the history of the NRA and their talking points from my experience in speech and debate, where we would have to argue on both sides of issues like universal background checks, both pro and con. I also was in a TV production class where we had learned about the news cycle, and I was aspiring to become a broadcast journalist. So I started interviewing my classmates during the shooting, not knowing whether or not we were going to die. I interviewed them and asked them what they thought about gun violence, what they thought about gun control, what they thought about the NRA, with the idea being that the top message that the NRA uses after these shootings is that you can't talk about this because you're politicizing these shootings. I knew that if my classmates and I, our last dying wish was to have something done about the NRA or about gun control, that it would not be possible for them to say that we're politicizing this when the very kids who died in that shooting were demanding action. Thankfully, I made it out that day with my other classmates, but unfortunately, 17 of my teachers and classmates did not. 17 others were also wounded. One of those that was wounded and survived was my friend and seat partner, Sam Fuentes, who sat in me the period before the shooting occurred in my astronomy class. Sam to this day now has lead in her body for the rest of her life and physical scars that will never go away. After the shooting, we all mobilized and asked students to mobilize around the country with us, walking out of their schools, demanding action. We boycotted different corporations that work with the NRA. We also stood up together, walked out of our schools, and had a march for our lives in Tallahassee, where we showed up to change gun laws there with our students. And then we had one in Washington, D.C., and in over 800 cities around the world, basically on every continent that doesn't have penguins. When we started out, we thought we were only going to be able to get a couple dozen students or a couple dozen, maybe a couple hundred people to Washington, D.C. But by the time that we organized after the shooting, a month and a half or so after the shooting in Washington, D.C., we had nearly 1 million people marching with us in the largest protest against gun violence in U.S. history. In the time since, we've passed over 200 gun laws at the state level. We've also registered over 50,000 young people to vote. We've also helped play a role in the coalition that's created the highest youth voter turnouts consistently in American history over the past 3 elections, with the highest ever in 2020. On top of that, we've also elected a new Congress and defeated more NRA-backed politicians than ever before in American history, as we did in 2018. But our work is not done yet. We've been mobilizing in states around the country, like Michigan and others, to help change gun laws and make them stronger. We've also been active on judicial advocacy, writing several Supreme Court amicus briefs for young people, young survivors especially, to get a voice in the court. In these briefs, we talk about the survivors that are impacted on a daily basis by gun violence, the survivors that are impacted by mass shootings, the survivors that are impacted by all different forms of gun deaths. We hope to use these stories to inspire, to show the justices the damage that weaker laws can do. On top of that, we've started getting more involved in active litigation, fighting against youth voter suppression in states like Florida, and also in states like Texas, to make sure that it's easier to vote on college campuses and that they can't make it hard. Along with that, we've also mobilized a generation. Just recently, in 2022, I worked on Maxwell Frost's congressional campaign on his kitchen cabinet. Prior to this, Maxwell's job was being the national organizing director of March for Our Lives. In the time since, Maxwell despite having very little money to run for Congress and not being a millionaire and just being a normal person and having to couch surf and Uber drive throughout his campaign, Maxwell now is the youngest member of Congress. Just the other day, as I was at Michigan State University in the wake of the shooting that happened there, I met with students from our organization and students from around MSU who now have gone through 2 school shootings. This is the America that we live in, where gun violence is not something that just happens to you once, but can happen to you multiple times, even if it's a school shooting. As part of that, though, I left there feeling hopeful, not only because the students' perseverance to organize in the wake of tragedy once again, but also because I met a young man named Jasper Martis. Jasper is a 22-year-old state legislator who got involved in politics after the first March for Our Lives. And now Jasper, at the age of 22 and after graduating from Michigan State University, is one of the youngest state legislators in Michigan state history. He is on the inside advocating as we are advocating on the outside. Not only are we marching on the streets, we're also taking our marches into the ballot box and changing who is in power. Because if our government won't change gun laws, then our generation and the young people of March for Our Lives are determined to change who is in government. But our work is not done alone. We've had many people come before us as well that have been doing this work for decades, such as the families from Sandy Hook, the families from Columbine, and especially Black and brown women who rarely get the credit that they deserve for the decades of work that they've done before March for Our Lives to help lay the groundwork for the movement. Especially people like Erica Ford, who's been active for over 20 years now in Jamaica, Queens, and New York City, running her violence intervention program called Life Camp, where they've taken young people and helped ensure that they have the resources they need to not pick up a gun or feel the need to pick up a gun in the first place. While we've had many setbacks in this fight, including the recent changes to the Supreme Court, luckily our generation has the most valuable asset that anybody can have in politics, besides a couple $1 billion, which is time. We have time on our side, but it's going to have to come from people like you all standing up and coming together with our generation as a whole and doing the right thing. Thank you.